At the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month, we will remember them. The 11th of November is one of the most important dates in calendars all around the world, especially in Commonwealth countries, and it is particularly prevalent in the United Kingdom, where commemorations mark the Armistice, the agreement to end the fighting of the First World War, as a prelude to peace negotiations on the 11th of November 1918. To this day, we mark Armistice Day around the UK with a 2-minute silence at 11 a.m, as well as conducting a nationally televised remembrance service on the second Sunday of the month, Remembrance Sunday, attended by politicians, religious leaders, military personnel, and members of the British royal family, and takes place at the Cenotaph Monument in central London. So today, as we approach both the 2023 Armistice Day and Remembrance Sunday, I will be exploring the history of remembrance and how this great day for honouring all those who gave their lives for this country since 1914 became such a strong bastion of our national consciousness. The fighting of the First World War had ended with the signing of the Armistice on 11 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918, and the conflict was formally ended in June 1919 with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. A letter published in the London Evening News in May 1919 suggested that a silence should be observed to remember those who gave their lives during the First World War. This suggestion reached King George V, who proclaimed on the 7th of November 1919 that a 2-minute silence should be observed in order to remember the sacrifice of the fallen. Quote, "All locomotion should cease so that in perfect stillness the thoughts of everyone may be concentrated on reverent remembrance of the glorious dead." Thus, following the King's proclamation, the first ever Armistice Day of Remembrance was dedicated in Great Britain on November the 11th, 1919, in commemoration of the 1-year anniversary of the end of the fighting of World War I. Remembrance Day as an annual tradition has evolved out of this first day, which was observed at Buckingham Palace, commencing with George V hosting a banquet in honour of the President of the French Republic during the evening hours of the 10th of November 1919. The first official Armistice Day was subsequently held throughout the grounds of Buckingham Palace the following morning. Then, at the request of the King, the nation remained silent for 2 minutes when the clock struck 11 to cease all activity and bow their heads in memory of those who had given their lives in the great struggle. As church bells rang out across the land and signal rockets were fired into the sky, all went quiet. The Liverpool Echo newspaper wrote, quote, "This morning at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the men and women of the motherland throughout the empire stayed their hands at their millions of separate tasks to perform a service of silent homage and remembrance. A year ago the fate of hundreds of thousands of men, and all that they represented to wives, mothers, children, hung in the balance. Everyone and everything stopped. Buses, trains, horse carts and factories all immediately halted. Electricity was cut off to stop the trams, telegrams, and even ships at sea were halted. Workers in offices, hospitals, shops, and banks stopped their work. Schools became silent. Court proceedings came to a standstill, and prisoners stood to attention in their cells." This remarkable event was a first in British history, and the effect it had on a nation still in mourning was profound. Newspapers across the country printed vivid, almost poetic descriptions of, quote, "those sublime moments of ghostly communion with the gallant spirits who now march in the heavens." The Manchester Evening News described the scene at the junction of Margaret Street and Cross Street in the heart of the city as follows. "When the maroon sounded, the transformation was immediate. All the men removed their hats, the mighty roar of traffic died as if by magic. A beautiful and impressive silence fell suddenly upon the scene, broken only by the melodious sound of a muffled bell tolling the hour of 11. For fully 2 minutes the silence was wonderfully maintained, momentarily broken once and only once by the sound of a horse's shoes clanging out on the pavement. For the most part people stood reverently with bowed heads. Others looked around, and the sight that was presented to their gaze will not soon fade from their memory. The solemnity of the occasion was stamped on every face. Conspicuous was a veteran cabman holding his horse with his left hand, his right hand at the salute, and his white hairs fluttering in the keen November wind. A striking and a dignified figure who never moved a muscle. At the end of the 2 minutes hats were replaced, the noisy bustle of the streets was instantly resumed. Many described this silence as a feeling of a nation not only in mourning, prayer and thanksgiving as they reflected on the past, but also a chance to look to the future in hope. This event became known as the Great Silence. Since 1920, Remembrance Day services have been observed at the Cenotaph in London. Made of Portland stone, the cenotaph was designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens and was unveiled as a permanent memorial to the fallen of the First World War on the 11th of November 1920 by King George V. Wreaths of poppies, the symbol of remembrance and a hope for a peaceful future, are laid at the foot of the cenotaph by the royal family, politicians, religious leaders, representatives of states and both the auxiliary and armed forces during the service. Thereafter, a period of silence became the centrepiece of Armistice Day events that occurred annually until the outbreak of World War II in 1939, when it was decided that general celebrations would not be held on November the 11th that year. Instead, for the duration of the Second World War, a day of dedication was instead held on the Sunday closest to Armistice Day, so that acts of remembrance could continue without affecting the war effort. After the conclusion of World War II, the British government, seeking to honour participants in both World Wars, officially replaced Armistice Day with the new Sunday observance, which was thereafter known as Remembrance Sunday. In November 1946, King George VI unveiled the addition of the dates 1939 and 1945 to the cenotaph, and the BBC ended its live broadcasting suspension that was in place during World War II, making the Remembrance Sunday broadcast one of the longest-running live broadcasts in the world. In 1956, the date was fixed as the second Sunday of the month, in addition to the remembrance services that would take place on Armistice Day itself, the 11th. The cenotaph, inscribed with the words "The glory is dead," forever stands as a memorial to the fallen of all wars and conflicts since the First World War. Now, before we get on to the modern remembrance ceremony and all of its impressive and sombre pageantry, I want to quickly explain the most recognisable symbol of remembrance, the red poppy. The poppy became associated with World War I memorials after scores of the flowers bloomed in the former battlefields of Belgium and northern France, which was depicted by the popular 1915 poem In Flanders Fields by Canadian soldier John McCrae. In 1921, the newly formed British Legion, now the Royal British Legion, a charitable organisation that supports the well-being of veterans, began selling red paper poppies for Armistice Day, and its annual poppy appeal has been enormously successful since. In addition to poppies intended to be worn on clothing, wreaths made of poppies were also frequently displayed at memorial sites, and of course are widely used on Remembrance Sunday itself, most notably being placed around the base of the cenotaph by members of the royal family, whose individual wreaths are adorned with their regalia and symbols, but also by the top politicians in the land, such as the current and former prime ministers and the leader of the opposition. So, with over 100 years of remembrance tradition, these ceremonies have certainly been refined and perfected. In this last section, I will outline the timeline of commemorative events, known as the order of service, as best I can. Alright, so the day starts precisely at 10:36 a.m, with a programme of traditional music beginning with Rule Britannia that has remained largely unchanged since 1930. This includes a selection of national airs, i.e. vocal ballads and folk music, representing all four nations of the United Kingdom and performed by the massed bands of the Household Division and the pipes and drums from the Highlanders 4th Battalion, the Royal Regiment of Scotland. As the band plays Dido's Lament by Henry Purcell, the clergy, led by a crossbearer, and the choir of the Chapel Royal process. This service is led by the Dean of the Chapels Royal, usually the Bishop of London. Then, during solemn melody by Henry Walford Davies, politicians, high commissioners and religious leaders from all faiths assemble, joined by humanists representing the non-religious. The parade then stands to attention in silence as the royal family emerge. As Big Ben strikes 11 a.m, the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery fire a single-shot salute from the First World War-era guns from Horse Guards Parade. 2 minutes silence is then observed. The silence represents the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, when the guns of Europe fell silent. This silence is ended by the gunners of the Royal Horse Artillery firing a gun salute. Then the Royal Marines buglers sound the last post. The first wreath is traditionally laid on behalf of the nation by His Majesty the King, followed by other members of the royal family and then by the Prime Minister on behalf of His Majesty's government before other politicians. A short religious service of remembrance is then conducted by the Bishop of London in their capacity as Dean of the Chapel Royal. The hymn O God Our Help in Ages Past is sung, led by the massed bands of the choir of the Chapel Royal. The whole assembly recites the Lord's Prayer before the bishop completes the service. The rouse is then played by the buglers, followed by the national anthem being sung by all. And I'm actually going to show you the rouse and the national anthem in its entirety here because it's such a powerful moment, and especially from 2022 when King Charles is also remembering his mother, our late Queen Elizabeth II, who of course served in World War II and was herself a veteran. So here you go. The king and other members of the royal family salute the cenotaph and the royal party depart. After the ceremony, as the bands play a selection of marches and arrangements of World War I and World War II era popular songs, a huge parade of veterans organised by the Royal British Legion marches past the cenotaph, saluting as they pass. Members of the reserve forces and cadet organisations join in with the marching, alongside volunteers from St John's Ambulance, paramedics from the London Ambulance Service, and conflict veterans from World War II, Korea, the Falklands Wars, and other past conflicts. As the veterans march back to Horse Guards Parade, a member of the royal family takes their salute in front of the Guards Memorial. And with this, along with further songs and unofficial wreath-laying, the Remembrance service comes to an end, after an impressive display of sombre pageantry in memory of those who have died in the line of duty. So that pretty much brings this video to the end. Let me know what you thought of this style of video that delves into the history of certain traditions, and if you'd like to see more, and comment if you have any ideas. As always, thank you very much for watching, and lest we forget our glorious dead.